There's tons of videos on YouTube about Dragon Ball techniques. There's videos about the best techniques, the strongest techniques. But have you ever seen a video about the gayest technique in Dragon Ball? Well, on this edition of Dragon Ball Dictionary, that's what we're talking about. The gayest technique in Dragon Ball. Let's get into it. Hey guys, Tony here, and if any of you are upset leaving angry comments about how there's no gay techniques in Dragon Ball, well, first of all, thank you for the engagement. I always appreciate that. But actually, you'll see what I mean by a quote-unquote gay technique. It's not actually a gay technique, but there is something to this. I'm not just outright making this up. So what technique am I talking about? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to go back to the final match of the 22nd Tenkaichi Martial Arts Tournament. Tenkaichi! This is where Goku and Tenshinhan face off in one of the best Tenkaichi fights in the entire series. Now you have to remember that this entire story arc, Tenshinhan wasn't simply presented as another rival, another person who wanted to win the tournament. No, he was set up as basically a villain. He was portrayed as ruthless, and it was made very clear that he wanted to follow in the footsteps of the assassin, Tao Pai Pai. And then when Tenshinhan finds out that Goku killed Tao Pai Pai, although later we found out that he didn't actually kill Tao Pai Pai, but that was probably just Toriyama deciding that he wanted to bring back Tao Pai Pai. At the time, it seemed like Tao Pai Pai was dead. But anyway, when Tenshinhan finds out that Goku is the reason that Tao Pai Pai is not around anymore, well, that fuels Tenshinhan even more, and he decides that he wants revenge against Goku. Because remember, Tao Pai Pai is the brother of Tenshinhan's master, his teacher, the Crane Hermit. And then, of course, there's that moment where Tenshinhan breaks Yamcha's leg, even though he doesn't have to because Tenshinhan had clearly won the fight. So when this match between Tenshinhan and Goku starts, tensions are high. The readers don't like Tenshinhan probably. He's set up as a total a-hole and we want to see him get his comeuppance. At the same time though, Tenshinhan is determined to not just win, but to destroy Goku. So the match starts and Tenshinhan quickly gets the upper hand. He incapacitates Goku, picks him up, and has complete control over him. And then he says something like, "I'll finish you off with this special technique that I've been saving." Chaozu sees this and he says, "Oh, he intends to use that technique." Meanwhile, the Crane Hermit laughs menacingly and he says, "Ha ha ha, that brat is dead." And then we see multiple characters concerned that Goku might be about to lose this match. Everything seems to indicate that Tenshinhan is about to unveil this epic technique that is going to take out our beloved hero Goku. But then it turns out that this was all a big misdirect on the part of Akira Toriyama because, yeah, this is all a big joke. Basically what Tenshinhan does is he treats Goku like a volleyball, he throws him up into the air, and then spikes him into the ground. Now, in the original Japanese, the name of this technique is the Haikyuu-ken. Literally, this means volleyball fist. Now, some of you might be thinking, hey, that's that technique that Gotenks uses against Buu. And yes, you are absolutely right. However, Gotenks does use a slightly modified version, but we'll talk more about that in just a moment. What I want to focus on here is that this is an absolutely ridiculous joke technique with a really interesting history. And that history, in a way, traces its origins all the way back to the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. But in order to really understand this joke, we have to break this down into its layers because there's multiple layers to this joke. Specifically, I'm going to break this down into 3 layers. So let's begin with layer 1 of this joke, the name, Haikyuu-ken. As I'm sure you know, Akira Toriyama loved wordplay, and Haikyuu-ken is a great example of this. In Japanese, there's 3 words that you can use to refer to volleyball. First, there's the Japanese pronunciation of the English word. That is bareeboru. And then there's the short version, which is bare. And then finally, there's the original Japanese word for volleyball, which is haikyuu. Literally, this means something like expel ball, bat away ball. The first kanji is something like expel, and then the second kanji is the kanji for ball. And by the way, maybe you've heard of the anime Haikyuu. Yes, the name of that anime comes from the word haikyuu because that is a sports anime that focuses on volleyball. Anyway, again, the name of the technique is haikyuu kin. That last kanji character literally means fist, but in this context, it's being used to indicate that this is a martial arts technique. You may remember Ken from other Dragon Ball techniques like Hyo-ken, the solar flare, and of course, King Kai / Goku's Kaioken. And by the way, Ken / fist also appears in the names of real-world martial arts techniques and styles. For example, Tai Chi, that's Taikyoku-ken in Japanese. And drunken boxing, that is Suiken. What really makes this extra funny is the fact that Haikyuu Ken kind of sounds like it could actually be the name of a real martial arts technique or style. In terms of the overall sound and the length, it's really reminiscent of something like Taikyoku Ken, which again means Tai Chi in Japanese. Like, I can totally see a scenario where you go up to somebody in Japan who doesn't know anything about Dragon Ball, you start talking about martial arts techniques, and you throw in the Haikyuu Ken, and they wouldn't bat an eye. They would just assume that you're actually talking about real martial arts techniques. But okay, that's the name. Funny wordplay, great, ha ha ha. But there's a lot more to this, so let's move on to layer 2. Apparently you have to talk like a girl when you do the Haikyuu Ken. There's two aspects that I want to focus on here. There's the voice and the language that Tenshinhan uses when he does the Haikyuu Ken. When Tenshinhan does this technique, he suddenly switches his voice. That's because normally he speaks in a rather deep voice. He sounds rather masculine, rather tough. But when he does the Haikyuu Ken, he suddenly starts speaking like a super over-the-top, hyper-feminine, exaggerated girly girl. And then on top of that, Tenshinhan also uses very exaggerated, stereotypical feminine intonation and language. So let's go over what he said so you understand what I mean. It all begins when Tenshinhan throws Goku into the air, and then he says, Haikyuu Ken iku wa yo! Sorry, I don't normally speak like that. That was my best Tenshinhan girly girl impersonation. So Haikyuu Ken is obviously the name of the technique. So this follows in the tradition of the Kamehameha, the Makanko Sappo, and all these other techniques. The Dragon Ball characters like to announce the name of the technique that they're performing. That is what Tenshinhan is doing right at the beginning there. But then after that, he says, Iku wa yo! Sorry, my feminine intonation there was probably a little bit off, but this basically means something along the lines of here it comes, or here it goes, or here goes, or here I go. So iku means go, and wayo is being used for emphasis here. However, the key thing here is that wayo is part of stereotypical Japanese women's language. Now, this is really important. This is just a stereotypical way of speaking. Most Japanese women in most situations don't use this kind of language, Japanese quote-unquote women's language. But again, wayo falls under this category. If you want to write a character in anime or manga or in a novel that sounds over the top feminine, they would use, for example, wayo at the end of their sentences. After Tenshinhan says ikuwayo, what happens next is it seems that Tenshinhan pretends to be multiple girls on a volleyball team playing volleyball. So he, I guess, passes it to himself. He sets up the ball. Then the next character that he's pretending to be, this other girl, says, hi, again, in a very feminine sounding tone. And this is actually in the manga. If you go to where this happens in the manga, you can see that Toriyama doesn't just write hi, he actually includes a heart right there in the actual manga. Like, it's a little heart. So you can tell that Tenshinhan is speaking in this feminine way. Hi is often used to mean yes. However, in this specific situation, it's being used more to indicate that this girl that Tenshinhan is pretending to be is acknowledging that the ball was set up, and now she, or Tenshinhan, I don't know what to call him at this point, is waiting for the ball. He's like, hi, okay, I'm here, it's coming. By the way, I don't really know that much about volleyball, so apologies for not using all the correct terminology here and all the technical terms. But basically, Tenshinhan goes hi and then sets up the ball. Maybe that's called a toss. And they're like tossing it to each other. He's pretending to be multiple girls, it seems. So he goes 1, 2, and then finally the ball is set up perfectly. And Tenshinhan takes that moment to say attack in a rather feminine tone, and then he spikes Goku into the ground. After that, Tenshinhan goes back to his normal manly voice, and that's it. He never talks like a girl again. The fact that Tenshinhan, of all characters, somebody who up until this point has not shown any sense of humor, he's this stoic, serious, kind of villainous guy, all of a sudden starts talking like a team of volleyball girls, that's pretty funny. But this gets even funnier when you think about the fact of who played Tenshinhan. The legendary voice actor Hirotaka Suzuoki, who also played characters like Shiryu from Saint Seiya. Saint Seiya fans, leave some comments down below. I love Shiryu. And Kojiro Hyuga from Captain Tsubasa. Captain Tsubasa fans, leave some comments down below. Both of these characters are quite tough. They have that Tenshinhan kind of quality in a way. So it's almost like Shiryu is all of a sudden talking like a girly volleyball player. So at least to me, that makes it extra funny. But here's a question. Why did Toriyama decide to make Tenshinhan talk like a girl during this specific technique? What's the relationship between the Haikyuu-ken and talking like a girl? Well, in order to understand that, we have to dig a little bit deeper. So let's go to layer 3, volleyball in Japan. Things are different now, but back during the time when Dragon Ball was being published, volleyball was thought to be primarily a female sport. Yeah, some boys, some men did play volleyball, but generally speaking, volleyball was a girl's thing. One of the key moments in Japanese history that shaped this idea that volleyball was a girl's sport was the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. That's because it was during these Olympic Games when the Japanese women's volleyball team defeated the Soviet Union and won the gold medal. Not surprisingly, this resulted in a big women's volleyball boom in Japan. And that popularity of volleyball also resulted in the creation of volleyball-focused media like manga and anime. Perhaps the most well-known example of this is the manga Attack No. 1, which got turned into a popular anime that began broadcasting in 1969. By the way, while I was doing this research, I came across a video that somebody uploaded to YouTube that is a compilation of all the slapping in Attack No. 1. I haven't seen Attack No. 1, but apparently characters slap each other a lot, and this compilation is almost 3 minutes long. I found it hilarious, so if you want to watch a bunch of volleyball girls slap each other, check out that video. I'll include a link down below. Also, here's an extra little thing. Remember how Tenshinhan says hi when he's doing the Haikyuu-ken? Here's a clip from a commercial from Attack No. 1 in which the characters are doing something very similar. I guess they're doing some kind of drill or they're playing volleyball, and you can hear them saying hi, 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 hi. Anyway, as we enter the 70s and 80s, it seems that volleyball still, for the most part, was played primarily by girls and women. And of course, the girls that grew up watching, for example, Attack No. 1, and that experienced that early boom in volleyball, well, by the 80s and 90s, they were in their 30s and 40s. So some of them would probably go out and play volleyball with other women their age. What this means is that the boys who were reading Dragon Ball in the late 80s were familiar with all of this. They saw their female classmates playing volleyball. They saw their moms playing volleyball. So in a way, Tenshinhan is kind of an imitation of their female classmates and their moms. If you don't understand this, then you don't quite get the joke. Yeah, it's amusing on a surface level, but there's this thing going on under the surface that is a result of what was going on in Japanese society at the time. Now let's talk about the English dub of this scene for just a moment. Basically, the dub completely erases this joke. The voice actor playing Tien doesn't take on a feminine way of speaking. There's no feminine language going on. So it's just Tien using Goku as a volleyball, which is kind of funny, but also it's not really that much of a joke. That being said, I totally understand why they would leave that out. If I had to translate this scene and prepare the dub and do all that, I probably would completely cut this joke as well, because like I've shown, there's a lot more to this joke than just, oh, Tien is talking like a girl. If they were to do that, it would probably be so confusing to the viewers that it would detract from the scene. So yeah, unfortunate, but hey, that's what I'm here for. I explain these ridiculous jokes to you. So if you enjoy that, if you appreciate that, hey, how about subscribing? Okay, so now let's talk about Gotenks. So Gotenks uses the Haikyuken against Boo, but it's slightly different. You see, rather than performing it completely by himself, he ropes Piccolo into this. And you could actually argue that this time it's even funnier, because it's not just Gotenks doing the Haikyuken by himself. He's getting Piccolo to participate, and Piccolo is reluctant to do this, but he ends up doing it for some reason, and then he says, "Hi!" just like Tenshinhan. He switches to that female voice again for some reason, even though the reason is for the joke, but there's no real in-universe reason aside from, I guess you have to do the Haikyuken like that. So this is really funny because, again, Piccolo is much like Tenshinhan in that he's this stoic, deep-voiced, arguably manly character. So for him to all of a sudden switch to that super girly voice, and the way Toriyama draws it here in the manga is also pretty funny. So I like this version as well. I can't pick between the two. I think they're both pretty funny and just very unexpected as well. Now, that is the last time that we see the Haikyuken in the original Dragon Ball run. However, we do see it in the 2008 special Son Goku and Friends Return. In the special, Gotenks once again uses the Haikyuken. What's interesting about this instance of the Haikyuken is that Gotenks specifically says this is Tenshinhan's Haikyuken. However, that raises a couple of questions. For example, even though in 2008 Gotenks acknowledges that the technique belongs to Tenshinhan, back during the Buu saga, Gotenks doesn't do that. In fact, he renames the technique. He calls it the Gekitotsu Ultra Boo Boo Bade Ball, which means something like smashing Ultra Boo Boo Volleyball. I guess you could just say that Gotenks was just giving this an alternate name because he was using this attack against Boo and he wanted to include Boo in the name. Or maybe when Toriyama was writing the Buu saga, he forgot that he had already done this joke? It's possible. But the fact that Gotenks in 2008 mentions that this is Tenshinhan's technique also makes me wonder, so how did Gotenks learn this technique? Did he just come up with it on his own, on the spot during the Buu saga? Because remember, Tenshinhan wasn't around. It wasn't like Tenshinhan was there to teach Gotenks the technique. So that makes me think maybe somebody mentioned the Haikyuken to either Goten or Trunks or both. And so that's how that information ended up in Gotenks' head. But hey, Gotenks is a joke character. I guess we shouldn't think too deeply about it. All right, so let's go back to the title of this video. Is the Haikyuken the gayest technique in Dragon Ball? In a way, yes, because when you do the technique, you end up using stereotypical Japanese women's language, and some gay men in Japan, including gay characters in Japanese media, do sometimes use elements from women's language like wayo and feminine intonation when they speak in certain contexts. So when Tenshinhan is doing the Haikyuken, he sounds like an over-the-top gay character. However, at the end of the day, it's just a silly joke, and obviously, just because you do the Haikyuken, it doesn't mean you're gay. And of course, Tenshinhan isn't gay either. But General Blue, on the other hand, don't get me started about General Blue. Well, you know what? Let's talk about General Blue. Let's do that right now. So you see, the problem with General Blue is that... Thanks so much for watching, guys, and let me know what you think. Did you know that the volleyball fist was something that traces its origins all the way back to the 1964 Tokyo Olympics? Crazy, right? But you have to remember that Toriyama wasn't creating Dragon Ball in a vacuum. There are things in Dragon Ball that are inspired by things that were going on in Japan at the time, and this is one of them. So crazy, but also incredibly interesting. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Help me grow this channel, please. I've got tons and tons of ideas. I just don't have enough time to turn them into videos, but help me grow the channel so that I can keep doing this and keep bringing you more content. And if this is your first time watching this channel or one of my videos, check out my other Dragon Ball dictionary videos where I do more breakdowns like this on jokes and puns and different aspects of Dragon Ball. See you in the next one.